Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the seminar, Militarism, Gender and War in the Nordics. I'm Noora Kotilainen. I'm one of the organizers of the seminar and also a former FIA person. I used to work here for 8 years. Now I'm here as a non-resident fellow and act also as a senior research fellow at the University of Helsinki, and I'm centering on militarism in Finland mostly at the time. So many familiar faces here today. Very glad to see you all. It gives me great pleasure to see so many new faces also. Couldn't be happier. I think this seminar focusing on war and militarization in the Nordics and beyond also, from feminist perspectives, could not be more timely. I feel that the discussion centering on implications of the current geopolitical situation and the quite concerted and often very grim tone poured upon by it greatly misses plurality, critical tones of voices and feminist perspectives. And this is why we are here today, to take alternative perspectives to war and militarization. We have a slight change of plans due to slight misinterpretation and problems with the time zones and time differences. It was supposed to be so that Cynthia and Lo was to give her keynote first and then followed up by the roundtable, but now this is reversed and we will start with the roundtable. And then we have some coffee and then Cynthia and Lo's keynote that we're all waiting for. But a couple of words on the background and practical organization of this event. Putting together this event and seminar has been a great joy and a joint effort. The event is part of a workshop series of Feminism and Wars community funded by the Joint Committee for Nordic Research Councils for Humanities. FemWars and Feminism and Wars, we call it FemWars for short, brings together researchers, practitioners and activists who share a belief that war is indeed a feminist issue. And we also investigate war and militarization from various feminist perspectives. And I think it's safe to say that we all here also share a worry, even despair, on how things are evolving now. In the Nordics, in Europe, but also more broadly, and how robust militarization is happening right now as we speak. Many of the FemWars people are here today also, and we all already met in the morning, and I must say I love you. It was great. I already love you. You don't need to know people so much or so well to love them. We had some great discussions and we will continue our workshopping also tomorrow. The FemWars community held its first workshop in Stockholm last June. And after this meeting in Helsinki, we will meet again in Reykjavik in October this year. And let's see what else comes from this community and our joint efforts. Something good, I'm sure. And of course, a big thanks to FIA, also Finnish Institute of International Affairs, for letting us be here today and also tomorrow, and have these discussions on war militarization in the Nordics. The seminar was supposed to go so that next would be my feminist sister, my partner in crime, Leena Vastapuu, assistant professor from the Swedish Defense Academy, how do you call it? Yeah, university. But her speech will be before Cynthia's, and now we will proceed to. And she will then introduce what Cynthia is going to talk about and her keynote more thoroughly. But now we will have the discussion or the roundtable on feminist kind of missed. Not so easy to pull this together. So roundtable on militarization starts during peacetime. Feminist perspectives on militarization of the Nordics. And the roundtable is chaired by the primus motor of FemWars, Professor Annick Wibben from Swedish Defense University. And the panelists are Elin Berg. She's a doctoral researcher in war studies from the same university. And then Sara Edalati, PhD researcher also from the Tampere Peace Research Institute Tappri. And then Professor Laura Junka-Aikio, from Professor of Northern Politics and Government from the University of Lapland. And Silja Para-Omasdottir from University of Iceland, Professor of International Affairs there. And yeah, without further ado, give the floor to you.
Thank you, Nora. Is this happening? Working? Good. Okay. So, hi and welcome. I'm the professor you introduced, Annick Wibben, Anna Lindh Professor for Gender, Peace and Security at the Swedish Defense University, and it's my pleasure to chair this panel with people at different stages in their careers, but all having really important things to say about feminist perspectives on militarization. What we're going to do is we're going to have one round of sort of prepared comments from each of the panelists, and then we will also open it up to you, of course, to engage with the with the various points raised from these different perspectives. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Silja to start.
Yes, hello, good afternoon. It's nice to be here with you with such a full room. As Annick said, my name is Silja Para. I'm a professor at the University of Iceland. And when she said prepared remarks, I prepared some remarks, but usually Cynthia Enloe cranks your brain up to a higher gear. So I was ready to put things in that she made me think about. So I will do some sort of off-the-cuff remarks as well. A part of the FemWars project has been a working group on militarization of the Nordics as a response to the invasion of Ukraine now almost 2 years ago. And this was a theme we came up with in our first meeting in Stockholm last year. And we are working on, which I think 3 of us here on the panel are contributing to an interventions in the journal Critical Studies on Security, which hopefully we'll have out not just this year. And my contribution in there is looking at the response in Iceland to the invasion of Ukraine. And one point that I want to make at the beginning, because I found out when our colleague Linda was reading the first draft, is that not everybody realizes that Iceland is A, a member of NATO, and B, a country without a military of its own. So speaking about militarization there puts it in a bit of a different context than many other countries. And the response to the invasion in Iceland was quite strong. We saw great support by the public for the Ukrainian cause, accompanied and maybe reinforced by securitizing moves by our government leaders who spoke very strongly about the need to support Ukraine because this was a war on us, a war on our values, the systems that we support, and the rule of law, of course, that is a fundamental contributor to the security of small states like Iceland. And this was taking place during the revision of Iceland's national security policy, which then also was reflected in a discourse in parliament that was much more focused on military security and militarized security than what we'd seen in the previous discussions and and policy making in that field. But what I found most interesting, what piqued my attention, was a civilian response that consisted of knitting. There was a project started called Send Warmth, Send dem Hlýju, to Ukraine. And this was led by individual women who started knitting and started sharing that they wanted to contribute to the war effort, help defend Ukrainians. And they have, there's a Facebook group where they share messages and encourage others. And hundreds of people picked up the cause. And in a few months, about 1/2 ton of woolen, mostly socks, woolen socks were sent to Ukraine. And why is this militarization? Well, it's very different to see the response to this war than to any other war. We've seen in the past, we've seen more like when the US invaded Iraq, there was a collection, there was a whole page ad taken out in the New York Times by a movement of citizens in Iceland saying, this is not in our name, because Iceland was one of the partners of the Coalition of the Willing. So it's been more like resisting war, saying we don't want to participate. And all of a sudden here you had this this response of saying, you know, we want to contribute, we want to help defend in some way. And I'd been struggling with, like, you know, this made me, as I said, very interested in, like, what was this? Where did this come from? And I finally found a way of framing this, and it's a field of research, sort of embodiment of conflict, participating in conflict, called martial crafts. So there's a tradition of crafting in order to support militaries. And usually you see this taking place within a country, so people supporting their own soldiers. But there's also an ongoing, as I think, still effort of knitting hats for Israeli soldiers, and people from all over the world participate in that. So doing this for another military is not necessarily unheard of. But it's a very caring and feminine way, and it's almost a way of putting the essentialized, natural, within quotation marks, role of women to care for the soldiers, like familial and mothering effort. And then, as this was going on, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, who was very active, and I don't think I've ever seen a Minister of Foreign Affairs in Iceland. We don't have a defense ministry, we don't have a military, remember? So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs handles defense. So this is also something I forget doesn't make sense to everybody. She then sort of picked the knitting aspect up, and she recruited a well-known young woman in Iceland who is a singer-actress, but also a very talented knitter and a knitting designer, and asked her to specifically design a sweater for Zelensky. And so she ended up knitting 2 sweaters. They have sort of the yellow and blue theme colors. And our Minister of Foreign Affairs actually ended up taking these to Ukraine, and she wasn't able to hand them directly to Zelensky, but they were passed on to him. And then later, the knitting, the socks and so on, they were merged with contributions from the Icelandic government of warm clothes and medical equipment that were then taken on a Canadian military plane and delivered to the Ukrainians. And this was actually what also was very interesting was the video that the Ukrainian military produced to thank Iceland for these goods. We have no way of knowing whether the socks were really needed or if it was just the assessment of women in Iceland that you're going to be cold, you know, in the field. But then the military has to take the time to produce this, say, thank you for something that, you know, maybe is useful. I have no doubt that it is. But maybe it's not what was really necessary. And at the same time, you had Zelensky traveling all over Europe and wider to say we need military equipment, we need weapons. And Iceland is sending warmth, it's sending woolen socks. So then the final point, because I think I'm talking too long already, yes, is how this then, how this is a, I forgot the point because she said wrap up. So, you know, I'll come back to that in the questions probably. Thank you.
So handing over to Elin Bay, is it still on? Yes.
Yes, can you hear me? Okay. I'm thrilled to be here. And the question, how does militarization start in peacetime? Yeah, I had to think long and hard which examples to sort of raise, and I've come up with two from the Swedish context, which I research. So I think they may seem sort of banal, or but I think they show how militarization sort of works to render war this constant possibility and something natural that we always have to be prepared for or preparing for, right, like an action. So first, a memory of mine. When I was in my early teens, I was walking home alone from school when I suddenly heard this incredibly loud warning siren. And I froze for a second, terrified, and called my mom in a panic. But she assured me that it was just the testing of Sweden's warning system, which we call Fredrik, which is not very threatening. So raspy voice Fredrik is what we call him. And while I sort of course, see that it's important to have a functioning warning system, this quarterly testing also does something else. So it reminds us that while it's perhaps not necessary to prepare at this moment for the exceptional, which in the Swedish context is war, we have to prepare ourselves for that at some point in time. So it reminds us that that may be around the corner, and not so very silent reminder, right? And no, not very silent. But I think it's also interesting because there's this idea that war is exceptional to the Swedish context because we have this narrative of having been a country at peace for 200 years, and there's the sense that it would be imposed onto Sweden, it would be something brought to Sweden, right, if war came. So that brings me to my second little example. And it was that in 2018, the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency sent out a pamphlet called If Crisis or War Comes, thank you, Celia, to 4.9 million households in Sweden. And this used to be a recurrent thing, but was last done in 1961. So I'll read you a quote from it. Many people may feel a sense of anxiety when faced with an uncertain world. Although Sweden is safer than many other countries, there are still threats to our security and independence. Peace, freedom, democracy are values that we must protect and reinforce on a daily basis. So what's interesting about this pamphlet is that it includes both hands-on tips for how to store food, how to keep warm during a power outage, but also provides guidance on how to resist and stay resilient in the event of an armed attack on Sweden. So again, the underlying assumption is that it would be brought to Sweden. Which I think negates sort of how Swedish security politics also produces a lot of insecurities and violence elsewhere, right? Through, for example, our export of arms, weapon system, etc. And both of these anecdotes relate to what we call the total defense of Sweden, which straddles across civilian and military spheres. So everyone between the age of 18 and 70 have a duty to participate in the protection of Sweden during both crisis or war. And it was reintroduced in 2015. And it reminds us again that the preparation and the preparedness is constantly needed. And there are other more blatant examples of how Swedish society has become more militarized, and we can look at the reintroduction of conscription, we can look at defense budgets, we could look at different military joint exercises that Sweden has been part of for over a decade with countries such as the UK and the US. But I think these two more mundane examples also showcase how the civilian sphere needs to also be involved in the militarization. So a last quote from this pamphlet, which I find very interesting, is that the level of preparedness for peacetime emergencies is an important basis of our resilience in the event of war. So again, sort of the preparation for any type of crisis, be it a flooding, be it a power outage, is meant to also prepare us in the event of an armed attack. So it needs to be motivated through the eventuality, potentiality of war, which I think is what militarization does. And it suggests that times war may be exceptional and the world is uncertain, but that is also recurrent, right? So we talk about times being exceptional maybe in the future, yet they are also always uncertain. So that's the constant tension. And so that's why I think that militarization starts during peacetime.
Thank you so much, Elin. I have so many things to say already, but I'm just going to not yet and pass on to Zara.
Yeah, thank you for having me here, and thank you especially Lena and Nora for inviting me and pushing me to think of the topic that I haven't think about it before, because my concentration in my research is, yeah, on something different for years. I'm concentrating on women's rights and women movement and non-movement in my country, Iran. But during the process of thinking of what does it mean militarization in Nordic in peacetime, for me, I could find some relationship between the militarization in Nordic and the realities that people, especially people from specific parts of the world, are experienced in their everyday life here in one of the Nordic countries, Finland. So my starting point, I hope that it makes sense, is reflect on the kinds of thoughts that I have during the process of thinking. This process of thinking was a start from thinking of these kinds of sounds of the fighter planes that nowadays we are hearing around. I don't know, I haven't checked, but it seems that our home in Tampere is located near the place that we hear these sounds much more, particularly when I am working from home. So I can call it signs of or sounds of militarization, but it has some other meanings for me because I have grown up and born during the Iran-Iraq war, and these sounds resonate with my childhood memories and a bit traumatizing for me, and all because always after these kinds of sounds I was waiting for something much more serious, but hopefully it's not happened here. But it's one of the points that I got from the thinking of militarization in Nordic. The other points that make me think of these recent elections that we have had in Finland and the increase of the budget in militarization issue that decreased the other kinds of the budget, and which is the hot topic in communities of immigrants, especially Iranians, that I am part of that. So militarization in this sense definitely have real connection to everyday life of the people here, and it can make a picture of how our life would be in an normal situation. As an Iranian woman, I know that how would be life in a normal situation, and how would be life in a securitized situation. Maybe the parameters that we are experiencing in a country in the Middle East is much more different from here, but in normalities is in normalities. So I know in a securitized society, everything, even very little actions and advocacy movement and anything can be considered and as a threat to national security. And by this sentence as a threat to national security, everything can be restricted and condemned and suppressed. So also it made me think of these so-called borders in the east that Finland want to make a fence or walls there, and the life of the more than the people that want to transfer that border as the non-human creature that and some kind of climate effects that this kinds of militarization approach can have in the region. Also, another things that came to my mind and during the process of thinking about the increased level of the number of the women in conscription and voluntary military education in Finland. And I know that there are some kinds of unofficial military training that I know that many people are registered for that, and the rate of the people there also increased. But I know that immigrants cannot register if they don't have citizenships or Finnish passports. So we can see that one of the general hierarchy is also there, and it is good to break the stereotypes that always soldiers should be men, but on the other hand, I haven't studied or researched, but it would be interesting to check that if other kinds of minorities, more than immigrants, have their equal rights there too, not just about the gender, but the other things also. It also this conscription and women in the war also again brought me into the experience of Iran-Iraq war, 8-year wars that where women were so active and be parts of the defense process against the enemy. But after the war, the memory, despite the extensive memorization and commemoration of the Iraq-Iran war in the country, which is continuing up to now and is dominated in everything in our everyday life in Iran, women's memories and women's narration of those days, particularly who were in the border cities of the country, and when one of the cities of Iran for 80 weeks was occupied by Iraqi forces. So there should be some stories of the raped and assaulted women which completely erased from the commemorations and memorization even after 40, 35 years. And I was searching for something about memory politics in Iran and tried to find something related to that memories, but I couldn't find anything. It was just one round table that was happening in one of the university, and one of the photojournalists who was participating in that time in the border cities was saying something and referring to that kind of experience of women about rape and assaulted by Iraqi. And it was a quote that I want to read for you. She was saying in that round table that in some parts of the Boston, I mean the city, there were some memorials for women. And local people put inscription on the hills saying that we honor your memory. But after preparing a report publishing in a women's magazine, one of the feminist journals in Iran, I encountered backlash from the officials, and I was questioned why I was sharing these images. When I returned to that area later, all the signs of commemoration had been removed. It's one of the experience in a situation that I call it a normal situation. And it is, and I am talking about the context that for years we were hearing the songs that the first part was war until victory. And even the years after the war, when I was a child, these songs was broadcasting through radio program every morning, war until victory. And we called the war of Iran-Iraq the war for motherland. And there were some gender kinds of perspective in the wars of defining this war, but after the war, nothing was remained from the woman. And for sure, the characteristic here in the Nordic context would be different, but pinkwashing of the topics and other kinds of things always with us and exist. We are much more respect martyrs' wife, martyrs' sisters, martyrs' mothers, but we don't mention the women who are participating in the war. So at this stage, it was the points that came to my mind and I wanted to share with you.
Sarah, on to Laura.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for so many really good points. Nice to be the last one. And I especially wanted to pick up the idea of sound of militarization because I happen to live in Rovaniemi, where air practice has definitely increased. And I think there is quite a big concern now. How do you combine Santa Claus, these fighter jets and peaceful nature kind of things? And here I actually wanted to sort of include in our discussion of feminist perspectives also the colonial perspectives to militarization. I think these perspectives should go together, and so that's the kind of angle from which I hope to comment. One good starting point is Yle online news, I think it was last spring, which had the headline, if I translate, there is up to a queue, people, or not, well, how do I translate? There's a queue to come and practice, do military training in Lapland. And then in this article, there was experts from southern Finland, Helsinki, saying that yes, it's great. There's a Rovajärvi training ground near Rovaniemi. It's the largest you kind of united, not fragmented training, military training crowd in Western Europe. So it's really great in Lapland because there's a lot of space there and it doesn't disturb civilians. So as someone who lives in Lapland and or northern Finland, the name I prefer to use for this region, of course, we know that there's no space in northern Finland that is not in some kind of use, even though it might look like forest. And there are civilians who are disturbed, and there are livelihood practitioners who will be disturbed, etc. So from the beginning, this idea really much looked like this repetition of the old terra nullius discourse, that consideration of northern Finland or the Arctic region or the distant areas that are the baskets of natural resources or whatever as empty lands where you can go and do your things because it doesn't disturb anyone because there is no one. And so I think, so I think that's a very important starting point. And just to go back to, for example, this Rovajärvi shooting range, it's not an empty area. This, for example, is part of reindeer herding area, so there's reindeer herding happening. There are important pastures for reindeer. Then there are private landowners still who have their houses there, who have their lands, who have not been able to develop them anymore, or construct it more, or really have anything to say with their properties, because over time doing so has become more difficult. So basically Rovajärvi shooting range has been there since the late 40s, but over time it's become more strict. There's clear policy of pushing alternative land uses away. And then, of course, there's the nature, there's the animals, there are all these things which also will be disturbed. There's the lack of tourism, because it's a beautiful area, you could develop tourism, etc. So just to mention a few possible land owners who may be disturbed. And actually, I was lucky because I kind of tried to dig inspiration from Cynthia and Lo, knowing that we would first have the keynote. So yesterday, as I was coming here on train, I listened to some of the online sort of interviews that she has. And she was talking about the feminist approach, or feminist kind of inquiry or analysis of militarization, in terms of how important it's always to look at the division of labor and ask who is doing what, where, who put them there, this kind of questions. And I thought that we should add to this the land question. What is being done to the land, by whom, where, and who put those land users there, and to whose exclusion that land use is happening. And so I've started now to do research on this military geography, so militarization of land, and looking at the ways in which military use of land actually has this large impacts, because it has always been a great driver of colonialism. Extractive industries and militarization usually always go together. For example, if you look at trains, railways, they are needed to transport natural resources. Often natural resources are needed for military purposes. They are needed to move troops. They are needed to provide security, the supply for the troops and for the home front. So the land use and militarization are really important, and when you develop an area based on military interest, that will have a huge impact, not just on those pieces of land, but on regional development. So if, for example, if we develop infrastructure based on military needs, that will have a huge impact on regional development of that area long time in the future. And I don't think we are seeing these questions asked at all at the moment. What are the, not side effects, but actually the, organic effects of militarization on our social, on the development of our societies? Then to add, I don't know if is that for me? Oh my God. I thought it was just laying there. So okay, very shortly. So very shortly, also we have to remember now it's also Sweden joining NATO, Finland, Norway, all of us are having these DCA agreements under negotiations already signed. And this area is also the Sami homeland area. It's Sapmi, it's the indigenous land of the Sami. And according to the UNTRIP, you're actually supposed to not militarize indigenous lands, but there's a caveat. unless it's in the vital interest. I can't remember the exact word. And of course, this is a caveat, because how do we always define what is the vital natural security interest? But at least you're supposed to consult. And so far, for example, in Finland, the Sami have not been consulted at all. When the DCA agreement was publicized, finally, for example, there's Ivalo included, which is within the Sami homeland region. And to my knowledge, the Sami read this from newspaper. They had not been included in negotiations. So my final very short point is that if we do militarization, or they do militarization, and it's done on the basis of idea that this land is empty and it doesn't disturb, this means that we end up doing it in a much worse way than we could, because there's no negotiations, no consideration, no effort at all to try to hear local voices. And I have given up. I can't stop the militarization, but at least as a scholar I can try to talk about this, how to do this well. Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody on the panel. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and say a few things myself. I think one of the interesting things that we are talking about here is what feminists, I think, do well, which is to point out that there are layers upon layers and complexities. So whether it's, the experience of immigrants who have maybe come from places that have already experienced militarization and war, whether it's the experience of, places that, have been colonized and are seeing the same patterns reemerge, the sort of very in-your-face pamphlets that Sweden has brought, or the mundane things of knitting and who is doing it, right? The people who are doing it. And I was thinking, as everybody was talking, about the book, edited volume by Megan McKenzie and Nicole Wigner on feminist solutions to war, where they describe war as a complex failure, right? So when we have gotten to that point, we have gotten to a complex failure of all the things that we know we should do better, right? And I think that this is maybe one way to think about this moment of militarization as well, that this is actually a failure, right? This is a failure of all the things that we have, for many of us, have for so long studied, analyzed. We know so much about this, and yet we see that we just go kind of back to the same old patterns of basically going to what seems to be an easy answer, right? We increase militarizations, we increase military solutions. Sorry, men, but we take a very sort of masculine, traditionally masculine approach to this. We sideline so many of the researchers and the research that is in the room. And we, just sort of, it feels like we are giving up and we are giving in, rather than take all that sort of knowledge that we have and really pay attention to how all these things that we know, all these little ways of doing things differently could actually make a real difference if only, we were being part of the conversation, if only we were being talked to, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that this idea that Megan and Nicole and others in the book sort of point us to, that we really need to think about this as a failure, right? And change the sort of discourse that this is not, and I work at a defense university, so this is not something to be sort of excited about, or yay, now there's all this funding, but actually we should be really sad, and then we should take that and sort of change it into a generative force for something different, because we have an incredible body of knowledge and insight shared across, sort of transnational boundaries, etc. And I think we really need to be much better at bringing that into the conversation. That said, I know there are a lot of smart people in the room, so I would really like to bring you into the conversation. And I think what we will do is maybe take one of these mics into the audience, and if you have a comment, make sure Lena sees you, or this guy, I don't know his name, sees you. Felix sees you. Okay, we have one on the left over there, and when you ask your question, please just say sort of who you are, where you're from, all that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is Janne Leskinen. I work in the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Human Rights Policy Unit. Thank you so much, Fia, for organizing this great seminar. I think this kind of discussion is now needed more than ever. Before I go to my question, I would like to comment first the invitation of the event. Here it said, gender equality is no longer a foreign policy priority in the Nordic region. I would like to somewhat challenge this notion. I know that a lot of the debate is now revolving around the hard security, but when we look at, for example, the work what our ministry and the other ministries are doing, this hasn't gone anywhere. If we look at the speeches, for example, of Foreign Minister Valtonen, the rights of women and girls are still lifted up pretty much in the upfront of whatever she says in the international arena, and we continue to work in promoting gender equality. Then coming to the question that I have, I think the chair, Mrs. Wibben, you really nicely wrapped up the conversation. And one of the questions that keeps revolving around my head is, could we somehow utilize the concept of I'm going a bit blank here, the concept of intersectionalism in the security conversation. I know that in Finland this term is somewhat politicized, but I have not found a better way to describe how security problems have different effects to different demographies in society. I think this is somehow, and how could we bring these points of view that you mentioned back to the conversation? I mean, none of this happens in a vacuum, and we have to look at society as a whole, and maybe if Ms. Junka-Aikio, as a Finnish scholar, could maybe comment on how do you view this in terms of the Finnish comprehensive security model, where we usually bring all kinds of actors together in constructing the safety in the society, including companies and NGOs. Thank you so much for the excellent panel. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. I would like to collect maybe another one or two questions. We have, now we have a lot of hands. People always need a moment, but let's, okay, we do.
Yeah, thank you. Tiina Vaittinen from the University of Tampere. I really love the concept complex failure, and then what you said, that if only we were listened to. But at this point of time, I think that's not the question to ask, especially as white feminists. I want to ask from us all, are we really doing enough and taking up the space to speak up at the moment of all the knowledge that we have? Everybody can go home or right now and look at the mirror, and are we actually, because as white feminists, we actually have power to speak much more than many others in these societies, and there is so much silence when it comes to the suffering taking up place in Gaza now. And just to comment to our foreign ministry, that if gender equality really is and genuinely is a priority on your list, you return the UNRWA funding stat, because that's gender inequality issue.
Thank you. This was really an incredibly insightful conversation. And my question follows from Tina's. I was wondering about the international implications of the militarization of the Nordic countries. And coming from Turkey, we have been implied in this militarization process with NATO in particular. And yeah, I was really shocked actually to see the defunding of UNRWA at this particular moment. Catastrophic humanitarian catastrophe is happening. We're facing, watching a genocide unfold and incredible suffering, and defunding the main humanitarian organization, UN organization on the ground based on allegations of a few people is really shocking. And I would love to hear your reflections on that, and and in general the international implications of this militarization here.
Okay, one more comment, question, and then you all are ready, I hope. Yes.
David Jerry Smith from University of Sheffield. My question was to Ellen, and to pick up on the point around how military solutions are being linked to disaster preparedness. How do you resist that in spaces where the military remains one of the only arms of the state, which is actually sufficiently funded and supported? I mean, maybe Sweden's not the context for that, but coming from Australia and the UK, the military is the response to everything because everything else has been ransacked to the point where it doesn't function. And then all you're left with these masculinist responses that aren't fit for purpose. How do you respond when there's no resources in any other arm of the state to do that work?
Okay, good questions. I will say we go maybe backwards. So that means you are first.
It's a round of questions, so I'll just pick some. Yes, the Gaza situation, UNRWA situation, it's such embarrassment to be part of a Western country in these days, I have to say. I have to say also that I have background in Palestine. I actually wrote my PhD on Palestinian Intifada and have lived in Gaza, so this really touches me. And it should touch everybody who hasn't lived in Gaza, obviously, also. I think this now ventures a little bit, but the question that I'm asking now, because you ask who benefits, who profits. I can't see anybody really benefiting or profiting at the moment. This is something what is really puzzling me. Israel is not benefiting from wiping out entire generation or like 3 generations of people. There will be so much hatred after this. The United States is completely destroying its hegemony. I mean, the West didn't have a very credible hegemony anymore, but at least there was a pretension to it. There was a pretension to United Nations being a body, an efficient body that can do something and that actually is governing something. And this is now destroying, and my impression is that I think everything that happens now, we should look at from a global perspective. Finland's NATO membership, militarization here, everything we should understand is in a broader framework of a changing world order. And in this context, I think it's very, there's a lot of consequences to the fact that we are even losing a pretension to Western values. And this means that to maintain the Western dominance, there needs to be more and more violence, brutal violence. And this is what we need. And I think to go to your comment that everything else has been wrecked, so the only answer now is military. And I think we need to see this globally. This is not also good for American policy for the reasons I've said. So I don't know who is benefiting anymore, except for some obscure military-industrial complex. But there's more elites than that. So this is my question: who benefits? I don't think anybody. Add to this the climate catastrophe, which they have completely forgotten in a race to produce more arms and destroy things.
Say something. Okay.
Thank you. That was, a great question, but I am not completely sure how to go about it because, as you were saying, even though we have this idea of total defense, like for example during COVID, it was very, very obvious that, for example, our healthcare systems were not fit to handle that type of crisis, right? And there are other things like the environment where the military is doing more harm than they are, they can contribute to the safety of the environment or the species. They are in fact driving biodiversity away. So I am not sure. Who profits and who benefits from it and how do we deal with it? I don't know, because they are the ones that also have, for example, the capacity. We had a huge traffic incident, for example, a couple of weeks ago in Sweden, and so the military had to be included to clear roads, and they are the actor that has that type of possibility to do that. So I don't really know. And also, the feminist foreign policy in Sweden is no longer put in place, and the foreign policy commitments have shifted drastically with our government. So I do think that there is, shifts happening in the Nordics. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for the questions. I want to kind of maybe respond to Jan-Elias and Tina together, because I think it's important to keep intersectionality at the forefront. And I think we can see when we're looking at most of the Nordics have now, for example, stated that they're going to defund UNRWA or halt their contributions. So we can talk about our Nordic response. We have an example in Ukraine where we saw, millions of dollars being siphoned off by high-level military officials. We're not cutting our response, our support for Ukraine because of that. So having 12 people out of a 30,000, thousands of staff being involved in this horrible attack, is that sufficient to justify this collective punishment? And that's, I think, because we're lacking intersectionality, that we're not talking about that. We're not looking at the fact that we have brown people on one side and white people on the other, and we are holding the brown people to a different standard than the white people. And that's a part of being a feminist scholar. I think it's really, really important that we have the intersectionality in the forefront. And I absolutely agree that we are not doing enough to speak about the atrocities that are being committed. Also in other parts of the world that like this morning we talked about Myanmar, and we know what's going on in Sudan, but we're not really talking about it. And I think, David, I just want to, because you talked about the military, I mean, this is also, what we're seeing everywhere is that the infrastructures have been hollowed out, the social welfare system. In Iceland, we don't even have a military. So our response is volunteer. So it's voluntaries, search and rescue organizations that step in, and we have an ongoing natural disaster. We have a town of 3,800 inhabitants that's been evacuated for over 2 months now, and the people who are providing the services to let people into town to go get their things so that they can try to rebuild their lives somewhere else. They're voluntary, and they're not even getting the support from the government that they are legally entitled to. So the neoliberal system that we're living in is making life difficult for everybody. And so I think it's who benefits in Iceland. I know it's not the military establishment because we don't have one, but other than that, I don't have much of an answer. Sorry.
Yeah, I will also pick up a few points, and I think one of the important points that has been mentioned a little bit and that we really need to think more about is the question of the sort of international order. I think that many of us who've been sort of watching things even before the latest war in Gaza, I mean, also with regard to the Ukraine, et cetera, I mean, we've totally forgotten about Afghanistan maybe as well. Of course, not really, but, we don't speak about it. But the question of what is the legitimacy, or is there any legitimacy in the international order? And I think the latest one now that we have to grapple with quite seriously is, okay, so the ICJ has made a preliminary ruling that, genocide is happening. And that puts that puts an onus on all of us, because it's not just, it's not directed, yes, it's directed in a way against Israel as the aggressor, but it's also directed at all of us, because, most of us at least come from countries that have actually agreed to be part of the Genocide Convention. So we have a responsibility under international law to do something about it, but are we doing something about it? And that includes, right, not taking funding from UNRWA, not selling weapons. So there's certainly some people who are profiting, or some companies or whatever. And also, I think we need to really question the priorities of the government in terms of, right, why is the military the actor that gets called out to do certain things, even though it was really funny during the pandemic. I remember the military set up like the Swedish Armed Forces set up like a temporary kind of hospital that was never used because it was actually not needed in the end, but also interesting, waste of resources. But where are the resources going? Why? We used to talk about sort of alternatives to military budgets and where could we use the money if we didn't give it to the military. I haven't seen anything like that. So this is sort of what I was thinking about, Tina. Like maybe it's also on us to sort of do more of that work, but also it's on us to sort of bring back maybe some of that work into the public discussion, right? We used to be like less hopeless maybe and more active. So, and I can include myself in that as well. We are overworked in the neoliberal academy. But yeah, I really think that the question of what is it doing to the world, the international order more generally, and what are the spillover effects that are very likely from all of these different conflicts that we're talking about, and whether they are environmental or sort of directly in terms of violent conflict. That's they are all there. And I have a question for you, Nora. How much time do we have? Because yeah. We can a little bit maybe take from the coffee break. So we can have one more engagement. Okay. So do we have a second set of, yes, okay. We're gonna try to get we can get all the questions and then we can talk. Yeah. So.
Hi, I am Carrie Reiling from Washington College in the United States. My question, I guess, it's about moral authority, I think, and I'm wondering, I guess this question is kind of about feelings. How do you all, as Nordic or Nordic adjacent, think about the moral authority of the Nordic countries? As an American, if you can't tell from my accent, as an American, we like to hold our moral authority, but we're also ridiculed about what that moral authority means, right, often by Nordic countries. And now I'm wondering, when all of you have been talking, I'm like, yeah, this is familiar to us. This is what we see. And so I'm wondering how you feel about the moral authority of Nordic countries moving forward, if that's shifting, if you feel like it's being more American-like, even if it's not American, if there's, yeah, that's sort of how you feel about that sort of thing. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Gunhild Hågensen Jerv at UiT, the Arctic University of Norway. Norway did not defund UNRWA. I'm just going to throw that out there. It's also one of the Nordics. There is, since the end of the Cold War, there is so much work that has been done, particularly in feminist security studies, and also branching into like human security and peace research and so forth. And there was this period of time with feminist foreign policies, at least among some Nordic countries, and then it feels like none of that matters. And I'm wondering, is it something that we have done wrong, or we're not effective enough? What is it? Where's the gap? I'm trying to understand that.
Hi, I'm a victim of the militarization. My name is Jarmo Pykälä. I'm the director of the Peace Organization Committee of 100. And it happened 25 years ago because I didn't know that I have an option go to the prison in Finland. And my question, one of the question is what we can learn in Finland, how we can crash down the system that we are forced to go to the military. Because it happened yesterday that we are probably having a new system. And you ask it what you can do. I think you can start from your own institutions. For example, the Finnish Institute of International Affairs is one of the leading organizations heading up the militarization. If you look the director, Mr. Aaltola, he is asking more the budget, and many of the people are now speaking behalf of nuclear weapons that we should start using that. So I think the question is what you do with your own organizations. Many of you are working in the defense universities. And one, I please you that don't go to questions about spending money for arms or the big questions about the power of the politics, because in peace organizations we have been doing this discussion very many years, and at the moment it's not leading anywhere. So please use your academic skills and very good arguments and be precise what you do, and please help us.
Hey, thank you for all the panelists for thought-provoking and inspiring talks. Elina Paju from the Finnish Defense University. And I was thinking, we're now discussing all these kind of like grand things, war, politics. But what I found interestingly in common in all your speeches was the sort of like very feminist thinking about personal is political. So that even though we talk about war zones and see the horrible things going on there, I think what is also very important for feminist research is what every single one of you kind of like touch on was the sort of like sensuous everyday experiences also of all the people who are not directly in the war zones, all of us who are like protected in our own nations, and how militarization also affects every single one of us on in every single day. And I think that is also very important for feminist researchers to sort of like make that apparent, that it's not just there where the bombs fly, it's here amongst us. And I think you did an excellent job from different points of view about bringing that up. So thank you.
One more in the very back.
I'm Ilkka Taipala. I worked in the peace movement in 87 years, and we arranged in Finland 1987 a worldwide symposium on women and militarism, and made a book, 500 pages. About 30 researchers from the world came, and Cynthia Enlow was one of them, and we translated the book also in English. We got literature about 5 meters, and Eva Isaksson in Finland read them all and edited another book about all the roles of women in and military systems. And that time we had a slogan: if you want equality, you have 2 options. You have to militarize the women at the same level as the men, or you have to disarm the men at the same level of the women. Women are the biggest demilitarized zone in the world. But now it happens crossroads. We meet somewhere, and the battle is where we meet. And we are very happy that Cynthia has made a new book, and we will translate also that. We send it 3,000 copies to all the women's organizations in Finland that time, 87. And I think the women's peace movement still is strong and will be stronger. So thank you for this seminar, and thank you that us men can stay here. We have still only women organizations, but we don't have only men organizations, not even only one.
Thank you for all the comments and questions. We still have 5 minutes according to you. Okay, so we have everybody gets to have 30 seconds to a minute to reply, and then we have coffee and we can talk more, and then we go back. Yeah. Oh, we're not.
Okay, I'll.
She's going to be online, so we test.
Yep.
Okay.
So then we go out for coffee. All right.
We go out. Yes.
I would like to respond to quite a few of the questions, but I'm going to pick one because it allows me to say the thing that I forgot in my introduction. Elina, thank you. The personalist political question. It's exactly one of the things that when I've talked about this, like looking at the knitting contribution from Iceland, people sometimes feel that I'm mocking them or saying that it's trying to belittle this effort, and I'm not trying to do that, but I read what they're doing as very political. But I think that in the minds of most people, it's not, and I think it's because it's supporting the policy of the state. It's adding to what the state is doing rather than resisting it. And I think that's where what is political to us can be very different. But I think this is very much a political action, is to participate in this, and this idea of the martial crafts of using your essentialized roles to support government policies or efforts is very, very interesting. And I'll talk to other people in the break about the things I want to say.
Thank you. So many interesting and important questions, comments. One that I would like to pick up on is the sort of Nordic exceptionalism, moral authority, and also, we've talked a lot about Swedish exceptionalism, you and I, but I don't feel great about it. I think that in Sweden there's a real tendency to separate between, we call it parallel strategic cultures. So we talk a lot about like foreign policy versus security policy, and so in the foreign policy sphere it was sort of easy for Sweden to assume this like feminist policy and talk about girls' women's rights and even LGBTQI rights, etc. And part of it has spilled over to the sort of strategic culture of security, for example, the protection of queer rights in Sweden, etc. But there is something that happens when you separate these two and you don't talk about how they drive one another and how they are in tension, right? So we don't want to talk about arms export and how that drives insecurities elsewhere, right? That's very uncomfortable for us to acknowledge. So I think this is something we also need to speak more explicitly about, and it speaks back to your comment. We need to speak up more. I think you also asked how we failed. Why is it, happening, these developments? Why are we seeing them? And I think it is, at least in Sweden, we have been passive. We have been extremely passive. We do not take the streets to protest or we are very, to strike. We are very passive and passive aggressive, I should add. So I think we should work on that. We should work on just like finding the voice to actually invert the gaze sometimes and not just, look elsewhere. Thanks.
Yep. The final things that I want to say is about to realize the effects of militarization on gender equality, feminism, feminist practices, and all the other things. I think that we can follow Cynthia Anola, what she said in her recent books, that we need to see that what was the situation before this militarization came to fore. Here in Finland and the Nordic has the reputation of the land to be the land of gender equality. But I always think that is it the actual and is it the real adjective that we use? Is it in reality happens? And these lands of gender equality include all kinds of women and consider all the diversities. If gender equality is still parts of the foreign policy of Finland, it would be nice to look at the experience before that also, to see that what is our positionality.
Thank you. Risking consuming time, I'll just say I have been thinking recently a lot about the wonderful teaching that I got from my teacher in Finnish language in Lukio, in the secondary high school. It was in Finnish, kun vähän pintaa raaputtaa, peto esiin purskahtaa. This is, in English it would be, if you scratch a little bit the surface, the beast will burst out. This is my takeaway from her great teaching. And I've been thinking about this because, Gunhild was saying, has the feminist peace studies, or what was the discipline, has it failed? I've been asking, have we learned anything? Because, it feels like, did the post-structural turn in IR ever happen? Did the feminist turn? did the decolonial, did even constructivist turn, like as if everything that we have analyzed about demonization, how you have to demonize certain people in order for wars to happen, all these different steps that take place in societies that tried to war, we have analyzed them after Second World War. We should understand the mechanisms and the warning signs really well. And despite this is happening. So that's why I'm thinking about this sentence. And I do think also that we are so complicit, I can't not understand how we're not using the space to talk. In Finland, we still do not get into prison. If you talk about your thoughts, maybe someday in this speed will be the case. So you do get a lot of shit, but you know, and also like, the level of the restrictions to public talk and what you can say are so high already, and we are not even in war. I mean, we are being kind of pushed into thinking that we are in an emergency situation, we are in a war, we should not have different opinions, we have to focus on surviving. But we are not in a war, far from it, to be honest. So I just want to conclude with this. We should use the space while we can.
So I will just thank everybody on the panel for their great contribution, for the audience for great contributions, and let's continue talking over coffee. Yes. Before we start with Cynthia's lecture, we have a short announcement.
Yes. In Tampere University, Tampere Peace Research Institute, we will have the second Feminist Peace Research in Finland Symposium in May. I really want to ask all of you to check the websites by searching this title and see the call. The call will open until we will accept the papers up to 15th of March, and we will have a very interesting symposium, and we had one last year. It was so inspiring, and people who were there really enjoyed. So please check the website by second Feminist Peace Research Symposium in Finland, and submit your paper up to 15th of March. Thank you.
Do you hear me? Yes, great. Wow, how great discussions. Thank you everyone for joining us. It has been a really, really nice and thought-provoking hour we've had, and it hopefully will continue, and I'm sure it will continue because we will have soon Cynthia Enlow on. Before that, I will say a few words about Feminisms and Wars community, and I want to take also the time to thank Fia for co-hosting this event with Feminisms and Wars community. You can read more about Fia, there are publications, but I just want to say a few words how this community was established in the first place. My name is Leena Vastapuu, and I work at the Swedish Defence University, assistant professor of war studies at the Gender, Peace and Security Research team. Dear colleagues, dear feminist friends and allies, Feminisms and Wars community was born late one evening at the kitchen table in Stockholm. This was in April 2020, when the official workday was done, dinner was cooked, kids were fed, and it was time to take a breather. As feminists based in the Nordics, we were extremely concerned about the increasingly worrying developments around us. The Russian invasion of Ukraine that had begun a few months earlier, of course, that was very worrying for us, but also the other developments that had already taken place as a consequence within our societies and were supposedly ahead of us. As feminists, we knew that war is always a feminist issue. We knew that we were likely also to witness ever more accelerating militarization across our countries, across the Nordics. Now, almost 2 years later, we can say that we were right. The Nordic countries have been militarized and are still militarizing as we have learned today. But we were also right that war is a feminist issue and that anyone who ignores feminist analysis of war as irrelevant misses something crucial about war, conflict, and most importantly, the possibilities for peace. Indeed, in the Feminisms and Wars community, FemWars, which is now a network of some 35 feminists, feminist researchers, activists, and is growing, we believe that war is a deeply feminist issue. Why is that? A few words on that. First, war is a feminist issue since war is always gendered. Gendered power relations and intersectional inequalities can be found in any societies at any moment in time, and these inequalities are further intensified during war and conflict. Second, war is a feminist issue since without grasping these gendered inequalities and taking efforts to address them, it is impossible to achieve a lasting peace. Third, war is a feminist issue since crisis, conflict, and war are fueled by various kinds of binaries. Without an enemy, the other, as we call it, war becomes impossible. The other can take many forms. Examples include sexual, gendered, and ethnic others, as well as otherness based on ability, race, or religion, for instance. What is important here is that the other is framed as the opposite of us, who in turn are depicted as the norm. We are the norm. Feminist intersectional analysis provides us with the tools to analyze and deconstruct such othering, which is not only important in itself, but again, also a necessary precondition for peace. Fourth, war is a feminist issue, since in times of crisis, we turn to all kinds of essentialisms. Women and children are typically depicted as victims, men and boys depicted as perpetrators. Just an example of these binaries. But we as feminists know better. We know that each conflict always carries its own gender logic, and that this logic needs to be carefully analyzed. And that this kind of analysis cannot be done in haste. It takes time. Fifth, war is a feminist issue, since when conflict and war enter our neighborhood, we start to prepare for war, as we have seen. We become easily militarized. Our minds become militarized. We take it as a fact, for instance, that white men in uniforms are the best security experts. And we do not dare to question resources allocated to the military or military purposes. What is militarization? We have talked a lot about militarization. There are many definitions. One alternative is militarization is the cultural, symbolic, and material preparation for war. And it can stretch to any segment of society, and as I said, also our minds. Militarization allows for extraordinary measures to be taken and thus undermines democratic values and decision-making practices. Today, we have the opportunity to learn from the best possible expert on militarization war and why feminist analysis is essential to understanding the ongoing militarization processes in Finland, across the Nordics and beyond. It is indeed a great privilege for me to introduce Cynthia Enloe, a research professor in the Department of Sustainability and Social Justice at Clark University. Professor Enloe's impact on the field of international relations has been revolutionary. In more than 15 books, she has exposed discriminatory structures in international policy practices and theories, and encouraged us to ask the simple question, seemingly simple question, where are the women? Observing world politics through this question changes one's perspective forever. Where are the women in foreign policy debates? Where are the women in global production chains? Where are the women in and around wars? Where are women in a country in preparation for war? We are here. A telling example of Professor Enlow's impact is that in 2018, her name was installed on the Gender Justice Legacy Wall at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Professor Enlow also encourages us to direct our feminist curiosity, a term she has coined, to everyday practices in and around international politics. She argues that we should indeed be curious about kitchens as a site of politics in the making, of women's unpaid labor, of silent practices that make the world and world politics go around. In her latest amazing book, 12 Feminist Lessons of War, published only a few months ago by University of California Press and Footnote Press in London, she draws our attention to the mutually reinforcing power of patriotism and militarism, for instance. Professor Enlow remarks that the combination of patriotism and militarism, I quote, has had a powerful allure for millions of men and for many of the people who have raised them and loved them. End quote. Why is it so, she asks, that we have chosen to display photographs of our fathers and our sons in their uniforms in prime spots in our homes? What kinds of values does this reflect? What does this say about our societies in general? I want also to take the opportunity to say that Professor Enlow was recently interviewed by Ulkopolitiikka-lehti, a magazine, foreign policy magazine. It's in Finnish, yes. The interview, and there are a few copies available over there. You can take one. Very, very good interview on her. So if you want to read more about her, read. But now we have to listen to Cynthia. Without further ado, it is time to learn more from Cynthia herself. Let's give a very warm welcome to Professor Enlow, whose keynote is entitled "Women's Wars Are Not Men's Wars. Does this mean that women are harder to militarize?"
Hello, everybody. Hi. I can't hear you, but I know you're there. And several people even came up and gave me early greetings when the sun was, well, it's not much sun, but when the light wasn't shining yet earlier this morning. It was great to see everybody. I'm so sorry I'm not there with you. Some people have asked about my muse. This is my toy giraffe here. And any smart thoughts, I think, emanate from the toy giraffe. She won't tell me her name. She has to keep some things to herself, you know. But she is a feminist, she says. So, first of all, let me thank both Nora and Lena, who have done so much to bring us all together and to bring me, at least virtually, into the room with you. I mean, I know that I'd be learning so much if I was there with you. Aisha has been great. She's been WhatsApping me all morning, telling me what's going on in some of the discussions. So I know that it's a lively setting there. Some of you know this, and maybe the book is on display, but I just wanted to remind us that this is not the first such discussion, of course, in Helsinki that has drawn people from all over the world. I'm going to show, can you see? This is the book that was created out of a conference in Helsinki in 1987. It was created by Eva Isaacson, who I believe is still very active. And Eva brought together feminists from Switzerland, Chile, Algeria, the US, Germany, and of course, Finland, to discuss the workings of gender in the military system. So if you go to a library, look for it. It's called Women and the Military System, edited by Eva Isaacson. It's in English. Maybe there's also a Finnish edition. It's definitely, though, in English. Do look for it. So I'm glad to be back here with all of you. And I've been thinking about how we can all go forward. We'll leave this wonderful, whoops. Have you, now I can see you. Oh, for a minute there, I can see you. Hi, hi. It's great to see you all. Many of you I know, some of you I wish I knew. But I wanted to think about how we can go forward and how, when we leave this room and these rooms, what can we all do in our ordinary lives to sustain our feminist curiosity, our feminist daily investigations of how militarization depends on ideas about masculinities, always plural, and ideas, often intimidating ideas, about femininities going forward. And so I've been thinking about a notebook, a little notebook that each of us could start, a little notebook that each of us could start just for our own eyes, not necessarily to be shared unless we want to, but an everyday notebook, not with full essays, but with what you notice about yourself, what you notice about conversations you have with people, what you notice about a billboard, particularly a recruiting billboard, what you notice about who dresses how that seems to be reflecting a more militarized sense of fashion. Never underestimate fashion. That we should start our own little logs, and these logs should be feminist daily observations and questions. It shouldn't be just what we know. It should be what we worry about, what we wonder about, what we've noticed for the first time. And perhaps this could be the start of what feminist environmentalists refer to as citizen science. Some of you have probably engaged in citizen science, which is where local people who don't claim to be experts, they just claim to be attentive, which is sometimes much more important than expertise, attentiveness. And they take samples of their local streams, or they take samples of their local soil. And out of that, they build our collective knowledge of what is happening to our environment. That's citizen science. Well, maybe we should have citizen feminist militarism observations. You can come up with a better acronym than that. But with our own notebooks. And then out of those, maybe we could, so go out and get your favorite notebook. I love notebooks. Don't you love notebooks? I mean, probably some of you use your phones, but really, a notebook's much more fun, you know, because then you could be Harriet the Spy and, you know, whip out your notebook and people will wonder what you're writing it in. That will make them curious and then you can have a conversation. But out of that, this is now a fantasy, but it's I don't know. More I thought about it, the more I loved it. And that is that people could maybe form little circles of maybe 2 of you, 3 of you, maybe in your household, your family, your neighborhood group, or just 2 or 3 friends, 4 friends, and get together maybe, I don't know, once a month. And don't reveal all, because the point of this notebook that you're going to keep, or that we're all going to keep, the point of the notebook is to be absolutely candid. You have to notice your own, my own complicity. I'm very interested in complicity. So this notebook has to be really honest. So maybe in your circle with your 2 or 3 friends or your neighbors or your household members, you won't reveal everything in the book because you're too embarrassed or you're not sure about it yet. But you'll start talking about what you've noticed. And maybe this will allow us to go out into our everyday, busy, hectic, pressured, overcommitted lives and share our noticing, or make us just more attentive. Because here's one of the things that we've all learned, and I've learned from all of you here in the room, and that is that one of the great gifts that feminist analysis, feminist curiosity has given to the world, and Lena mentioned this so well as part of the Feminism and Wars community understanding of why war is a feminist issue and militarization is a feminist issue. And one of that is that feminists, more I think than almost any other analyst, know how to go between the micro, daily, mundane lives, our intimate lives even, and what looks like the macro, the international life. We know how to go between what we find ourselves admiring and what our governments are trying to cut in social benefits. We know how to go between affection and campaigns for military recruitment. I think feminists really, we're still developing it. We're not at the end of our learning, but I think we've done more work than perhaps any other sort of feminist, any other sort of analyst in making the connections, the causal connections between the micro, the daily, and the intimate, and the macro, the international, and the formal. We know how to make those connections, but we have to chart them. So charting foreign policy decisions about the funding of humanitarian groups in Gaza, that matters. It matters a lot. But it also matters what we think when we hear that a nephew is thinking of joining the military. We put those two things together. Not just the nephew joining the military, what we personally think about that. Will it be good for him? Will he find purpose when he's been wavering as to what to do with his life? What will we honestly think? That's what goes into the book. Not what we want people to imagine we think, but what do we feel? What do we think? And feminists have the capacity to make those connections, but we're especially good at sharing and sharing our puzzles. Now this gets into kind of more risky ground. That is really sharing with other people our inclinations that we're a bit embarrassed about. But that matters. It also matters as to who we talk with. I think a lot of our understandings of militarization. Now, I've learned this from Aisha, who's there in the room with you today. A lot of our understandings of militarization come out of conversations that are not necessarily as focused as a formal discussion, but conversations that allow us to go from micro to macro, from personal to international, from informal and casual to institutional and formal, those sorts of conversations. And they happen in a lot of different settings. Sometimes you won't even have your notebook handy, but afterwards you should. After you have that conversation and you think, oh, I never really thought about that before. Oh, gosh, that's me. Because in our conversations, I think one of the things, I know, isn't this funny? Here we are. Here we are on Microsoft. Are we on Microsoft Teams? Is that our platform today? Anyway, we'll try to ignore that. But here we are with the written word. And I thought about thinking about, whoops, how do you get this so it's straight? There you go. I think a lot about how we are all thinking about security. One of the lessons I've learned over the years is to beware of anyone who is called a national security expert. To beware of national, because who is in the nation? When the national security expert is speaking or asked to talk on nighttime television. What national are they thinking of? National, in national security expert. National is always, always, always problematic. Don't let anybody or yourself or myself use the word national without pausing. If it's in writing, put quotes around it so that the reader pauses. Security. Whose security? Annick Vibben, who's there in the room with you also, is one of the people who's helped us think about how to even study the multiple understandings of security. If there is one sense that you can have a conversation about with anybody, with your 12-year-old daughter, with your 63-year-old uncle, with your neighbor while you're chatting outside, you can have a conversation about security. What makes you feel secure? What makes anybody feel secure? And that conversation will go in many directions. I've just finished reading the autobiography of Monica, M-O-N-I-C-A, McWilliams, capital M, small c, Williams, who was and is one of the premier, she probably wouldn't say this, but she is one of the premier feminist peace builders in Northern Ireland. And she's also a specialist, Monica McWilliams. She's also a specialist on domestic violence. That makes her a very knowledgeable person. And Monica says in her wonderful autobiography, by the way, wonderful, says one of the hardest things to get into any peace negotiation, and she was one of the people who hammered out the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. One of the hardest things to get in was any provisions for what most Northern Irish women, whether loyalist or nationalist, whether Protestant or Catholic, one of the hardest things to get in was their shared sense of what would provide security. Economic security, physical security, social security. Security is worth having conversations about. Don't worry if the person with whom you're having the conversation has never used the word in any language, Finnish or Icelandic or Scandinavian languages, has never used the word militarization. Don't worry about that. Have the conversation about what makes you feel secure. What makes your family feel insecure? What makes your workmates feel insecure? Which, of course, is very pertinent today in Helsinki. A lot of people can talk about insecurity more easily or more graphically or more meaningfully for them than can talk about security, since feeling secure is so rare for so many people. Feeling insecure is much more common. National is problematic, always. And problematic means worthy of conversation, worthy of exploration, worthy of wondering about, worthy of being attentive about. Security, always, always, always worthy of conversation, of investigation, of attentiveness, of feminist questioning about whether insecurity is the same for women as it is for men. Is insecurity the same for boys as it is for girls? Why? Why not? And then there is, of course, expert. I actually try in my own life never to use the word expert, at least when I'm talking about feminists, because feminists don't set themselves up as experts. Specialists, yes. Specialist means you pay a lot of attention. You try to investigate methodically. You listen really hard and all the time. You read and listen between the lines to increase your understanding. That's a specialist. An expert is somebody who claims authority. And authority is what attaches to them much more than curiosity. And expertise, as all of you already have been discussing, I think, expertise is highly patriarchal. That is, it attaches, whether to women or men, it attaches to masculinity. Expertise, and a lot of us sometimes are tempted to claim it because it's the only way anybody will listen to us. But expertise is always hierarchical. It's always somebody claiming knowledge, talking, usually down, to people who allegedly don't have that knowledge. Expertise claimed, expertise awarded, confirms patriarchy. Put together, national, which is always gendered. That's why laws about marriage and whatever that means, intermarriage, are so crucial to nation builders. And as a feminist, of course, I'm always on guard about marriage. Security, always to be wondered about, always to be listened to, in conversations about. Always to be curious in its genderings. Expert. Always to be wary of. Always to watch who gains. One of the things that is happening in all our societies as they become militarized is that national security experts, with no quotes around them, with no skepticism about that phrase, are becoming more prominent in your logbook. Watch yourself noticing who you accept as an expert about security, and wonder why you do. That is, keep a critical eye on yourself, but a curious eye on yourself. Don't just condemn yourself, be curious about yourself. National security expertise becomes much more prominent as a country, as a society, deepens its militarization. But I don't want to be grim, and you're not grim. This is not a grim group, I can tell. Anything that can be militarized can be demilitarized. Anything. Anything that can be militarized can be demilitarized. And here's a warning, and I've really learned this from Ukrainian feminists, especially today. Ukrainian feminists are amongst my current tutors. For instance, feminists in the Lviv-based group called Perspectives. It's Women's Perspectives, I believe is the way it's translated from Ukrainian, in Lviv. And here's what they've, amongst the many things they've been teaching me. And that is that militarization isn't all or nothing. Militarization isn't a greasy pole that once you're on the pole, you will slide down with no resistance, with no friction, with no possibility of stopping. Militarization is not all or nothing, Ukrainian feminists have taught me. That is, if you are facing the Putin regimes, and it's a regime, not just a government. I use regime quite specifically for a certain kind of governing system. Putin's regime's imperialist, militarized aggression is not, Ukrainian feminists have told me, is not something that should be accepted. That taking defensive action after February 2022, on the other hand, they tell me, does not mean you have to accept all aspects of militarization. You can be for defensive action against the Putin forces' daily violation of international law with the killing of civilians. You can take defensive action against the Putin government's military action and yet not stop your work against men's violence against women within your own society. Many militarizers would like us to imagine that militarization is all or nothing. That once you justify any kind of increasing militarization, expanding the military uniform force, spending more money on certain kinds of weaponry. That once you do that, there's no resistance to all kinds of militarization, including the valorization of a very narrow kind of masculinity, the acceptance of national security expertise, the cutting of the health and education budgets. But what I've learned from many feminists, and most recently from the very hardworking, overwhelmed Ukrainian feminists, is that militarization is not all or nothing. That you can continue to work for feminist equity, not just equality, equity. You can work for fairness and against violence and against misogyny, even if for defensive reasons you find yourself approving some very particular militarized actions. Now that probably is really hard to accept because it oftentimes does feel, and my guess is that as you write in your little citizen science observations of militarism booklet for yourself, it will feel sometimes, if you let even yourself admire or approve of or accept, those are different, any kind of militarization, you're gone. You're sliding down the greasy pole. You won't be able to stop. But that isn't true. That gives more power to militarization and to militarizers than you should give them, than I should give them. Militarization isn't all or nothing. You can be critical of, you can resist very particular militarizing steps, ideas, movements, policy initiatives, while you accept others. Militarization is not all or nothing. That gives too much power to the militarizers. That's what Ukrainian feminists are trying to teach us. It is not all or nothing. Militarization can be stopped in its tracks. It's always on a spectrum. It can be reversed. It always can be, of course, challenged. But it means that we have to keep our feminist curiosity in high gear at the micro level of everyday life, of intimate relations, of personal, unspoken feelings, as well as watching and challenging the macro institutional movements. But we're feminists. We can do that. Thanks.
Yes. Hey, Cynthia, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hey, Annick.
You see me too? Oh, no.
Yes, I can see you. I can see everybody. Well, I can see almost everybody.
So I'm gonna ask people to ask questions.
Or make comments or
Questions. thoughts,
Whoops,
feelings,
I can't hear.
comments, questions, thoughts, feelings?
Yeah, any of those.
Okay, right behind you. And let's see if that works.
Hello, Cynthia.
Hi.
Can you hear? But we met 87. I just reviewed your book to Menacing Conflict and Survival magazine. And you wrote there, everything can be militarized, even gender equality.
Even?
Equality.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
How?
So she's asking, please tell us how.
Yeah. Well, this has come to me, I think, and in this case, it helps to be an American, because the sense of we are amongst the most fervent militarizers of equality. This is a very good place to do field research, this country. This is not the good news, by the way, but this is a very good place to watch how equality can be used to militarize. And the way it's happened in this country, and my guess is that it's happening in many other countries as well, is especially through women's recruitment into uniformed military forces. And there's a huge range, by the way, in the world, as you all know, or probably some of you know. If you don't watch this sort of thing, don't worry about it. But there's a huge range in the world these days between countries, governments, and, by the way, insurgent forces. I'm very interested in the claims of equality within armed insurgencies as well, and which armed insurgencies are virtually masculinized, and which armed insurgencies, past and present, have had a very high proportion of women carrying weaponry. But particularly state militaries, if they want to win popular legitimacy in the early 21st century, will oftentimes tout, that is celebrate, the percentage of women that they're bringing into the military. And for a lot of young women, that can be very enticing. When any formally masculinized occupation, whether it be carpentry or banking or computer science or the uniformed military, opens a door a crack to women, whereas before they shut the door. For a lot of young women, and for the supporters of young women, that can seem like a step towards equality. And we have to think really, really hard about that. One of the things I've learned over the years, well, actually, I've been taught, I don't know anything. I've been taught everything. And one of the things I've been taught is do not slip into what sounds like feminist arrogance when talking to or talking about young women who join militaries, whether insurgent or state. Do not, and I've done this, that's why I know how bad it sounds when people come up to me afterwards and say, "What are you talking about?" When I portray women, young and not so young, who join or make careers in uniformed militaries, when I portray them seemingly as mere puppets of patriarchy. as dupes of the oppressors, as unwitting vehicles of militarization. And what I've learned from a lot of women who've been in militaries is it may be true that patriarchal militarizers have their own instrumentalist, nefarious uses for women in the military. But that's not the whole story. And I had better learn to take seriously why any woman would want to join a military. I better listen to her, talk to her, follow her over time. And this is true of women in insurgencies as well. I better listen. I better take seriously their own motivations. And once they're in the force, the uniformed, militarized, masculine, dominated force, I better listen to what they try to do to lessen the misogyny or lessen the militarization of their own lives. I am very dubious, and that's why you're quite right to ask about the militarization of equality. I'm very skeptical of the militarization of equality. But I've learned I can be skeptical and try not to be arrogant. I can be skeptical and try to stay curious.
Thank you, Cynthia.
Sure, thank you for such a good question.
Yes, good points. We have two right here in the front. Maybe we can take the two together. Can we take two together? Cynthia?
Okay, if they're not two, they're going to be sophisticated questions. I know they're going to be, and then I'm going to have to hold two sophisticated questions in my mind. Let's take one at a time, and I'll try not to be so wordy in my answer.
I'll try to make a clear question. Hi, I'm Laura Junkaikio from University of Lapland. Yesterday, I was listening to a series of interviews of you from YouTube in order to, have a lot of good questions. And one of the things you were saying, this was 6 years ago, I think, you were discussing the new practice of military training between the United States forces and Fiji and New Zealand, etc. And you were talking about this kind of practice as a new form of using power, so emerging kind of new form of using power, the increasing co-training, military training of US forces abroad with other forces. And I wanted to ask, because in Nordics, we are now all signing up for these defense collaboration agreements with the United States. And clearly there's a new way of using power through military in this region. So I would be super curious to know, what do you think about this? Is there anything you would like to add to the conversation you had on YouTube 6 years ago on this thematic?
Hi, oh, this is really, these things come back to haunt you, don't they? I mean, no telling what somebody is going to dig up. Anyway, you just hope that, well, if you change your mind, at least say you've changed your mind. But I haven't, thank you for that good question. I have not changed my mind. I think that interstate military training has been for actually a long time, this is not new, a long time, a pathway towards militarizing international relations. And many things are learned in this sort of training that are not on the formal agenda of learning. It's learning how to be a man. It's learning what is the proper way, not just to handle a sophisticated piece of weaponry, but what's a proper way for men to interact with other men. And I think in international training, there is an expectation of who will be the mentor and who will be the learner. It's with American forces especially. it's always the presumption that the American forces, and sometimes that will include American military uniformed women as the model. Look out, look out, look out. They will always be presumed to be the modern. They will always be presumed to be the sophisticated. They will always be presumed to be the model to copy. What is never involved in US training of other, or sometimes it's called joint exercises, but look out, joint exercises are almost never between equals. Ask South Korean feminists. There are a lot of people who are our tutors here, and South Korean feminists are very important in this. So are Japanese feminists. And what is never included is the US military as a model for how to give impunity to male soldiers who are violent against women soldiers. Because that, for a feminist, is one of the things that stands out about the US military, is the impunity that has been accorded for years on male uniformed soldiers who are violent, oftentimes sexually violent, against women uniformed soldiers. The US military is never being held up as a model for how you use the notion of collateral damage to engage in war crimes against civilians in war zones. So yes, watch joint exercises, watch training. And it's not always the US, it's sometimes the French military, it's sometimes the British military. My guess is sometimes it'll be the Swedish military. Watch which gender presumptions are being shared. Good question, and a good place for a feminist curiosity.
And sometimes it might be the Finnish military too. We have a question here, and then a question in the back, and then lots more questions. Let's start here. Hello, Cynthia. This is Susanna Hust. I've been reading your book, The 12 Feminist Lessons of War, and I found a very difficult question in there. It's an important question, I think, for us. At least in Finland, where we are trying to challenge the national security experts, and we are not very popular. I think we are even portrayed as traitors, because we love the patriotic, I don't know, ideologies here, and yes, so we kind of become enemies of the states, I guess, with our kind of critical views. So I found the most difficult question in your book. So I'm going to read it, and I hope you can reflect and help us to have to talk about this here. So the question is, when is militarized action compatible with, even in furtherance of feminist political goals? So when is militarized action compatible with feminist political goals? I honestly have no idea. I hope you can shed some light on this. Thank you.
You're absolutely right. This is very tough. And if already in Finland, there are some Finns who are calling feminist critics traitors or unpatriotic. It's true, you're quite far down the path. That doesn't mean you're all the way down the path. Again, don't give militarizers too much power. But it does, that's very, very tough. Is there any time? I mean, I asked this question to keep myself really on my toes. That is there any time when military action is compatible with feminist goals? And this is why I think the war in Ukraine, but more importantly for me, because I'm not going to second guess Ukrainians. I'm not going to second guess Ukrainian feminists. That would be arrogant to the max. But I do listen very carefully to those feminists in Ukraine, those Ukrainian feminists who've been kind enough to share some of their ideas with me. And I do understand that they, in February 2022, could not simply roll over to Putin's aggression. I do understand that. I am not so supercilious as to say negotiate with an imperialist. Negotiations probably will have to happen. They always have to happen. But what I realized is that I spent years, I started out as a Southeast Asia specialist, especially the country of Malaysia. And I'm still learning how British imperialism worked. I barely understand how French imperialism worked. I'm not at all sure I understand how Portuguese imperialism worked. But what I do know is I didn't spend any time comparing British imperialism with Russian imperialism. And I've been taken to task, rightly, by Polish feminists, Ukrainian feminists, for being so uncurious about the workings, past and current, of the Russian state's imperialist efforts and the consequences for those who've been oppressed by it or occupied by it. So to answer your question, when is, if ever, military action of any sort? Because again, military action has a lot of different forms and a lot of different ranges. All military action should be treated by feminists with a high degree of attentive skepticism. But I try really hard never to mush aerial bombing together with defense of an urban neighborhood on the ground. I'm really worried that sometimes we collapse things that are quite diverse into one, and that makes them look more powerful. So this probably sounds, and you're right, if it sounds to your ears, as if there she goes, weaseling out of answering the question. But it is one reason why I stay very attentive to Ukrainian feminists. They're now in month 24. And every month of this aggressive war by the Russian state increases the pressures to give in to total militarization on Ukrainians' part. So when we keep our book, I'm really into this now, you can tell, I'm our little logs to ourselves. Be sure and write at the top of the page the date, because it does matter if it's the first month or the 24th month.
Thank you. Pass it on. We have a lot of questions. We have one in the back, and then we keep going. So, short questions, short answers, maybe, Cynthia. I don't know if that's possible.
He's a very good professor.
I have to start handling questions here. I know the problem. Go ahead.
Hi, Leah. So this is Charlie Slonius Pasternak. I do have a question, but I came here mainly to listen. But upon listening, I thought I should also give a reflection. I agree certainly that the US military has an epidemic of sexual harassment and issues regarding rape. I would say that perhaps your descriptions of what military exercises entail, having done quite a number of them, maybe I wouldn't entirely agree, but that's a separate discussion. My question is, however, in Finland, every citizen has an obligation to assist in the defense of Finland. However, I would love to hear your perspective of how one might defend the idea that only men are subjected to this, or then why women should be kind of excused from this service. Thank you.
Yeah, let me make a short answer here. This has been, as you know, discussed in Norway, in Sweden, as well as in the US, of course, in Israel, and in other countries. That is whether a male-only conscription is legitimate and what feminists should think about it. Most feminists I know think that nobody should be under compulsory military service requirements, men or women. That is giving the state, and Aisha, who is here, can talk about this in Turkey, giving the state military conscription authority over men or men and women is a highly dubious authority to give any state.
We have Gunhild, and then I will come back to the front.
Hi, my name is Gunhild Hågensen Bjørn, and I work in Tromsø, Norway. And everything we've been talking about, at least from how I've understood it, is like militarism, really thinking about this sort of box, a clear definition between civilian and military. And the military is a uniform, the military is with the weapons, with the machinery. I'm curious what you think about arguments being made that states, and particularly democratic states, can be destabilized by virtue of exacerbating existing prejudices we have in our population. And what I mean, I think you mentioned the United States as being a nice case study. It's like low-hanging fruit. It's like the poster child for everything that is a bit dodgy. So one of the things is that that there is movements that are anti-LGBTQ, anti-reproductive rights, anti-people of color, and there's a movement to try to squash those rights, all of these different types of liberties and freedoms for people in the, and that people see rights for people who are in minorities or whatever, or marginalized, are actually threats to them. And this is becoming politically salient. I'm curious what you think about initiatives to try to manipulate and exacerbate the divisions between in the civilian domain amongst people, and how that is problematic, or how it fits into your understanding of militarization.
Thanks a lot. And your question, which is a very pertinent one for all of our societies, and political parties are running on those divisions. I bet there's not a person in the room here who can't name a local political party who isn't running on these divisions to exacerbate them, to legitimize them, to institutionalize them. Divisions are the very stuff of patriarchy. Divisions, as Lena said when she outlined the 5 ways in which war is a feminist issue. And if you recall, and maybe, by the way, Lena, it would be great if everyone could get a copy of your introductory remarks, not the ones about me, the ones about the origins of the feminism and war community. It'd be great if your opening remarks, Lena, could be circulated, because one of the things you so well pointed out is that this community of Nordic feminists and others who are taking part realize that dividing people, particularly dividing people and then setting them up in a hierarchical relationship to each other, to rights, to the state, to the economy, to social benefits. Dividing each other and then setting them up hierarchically is the sine qua non of sustaining a patriarchy. And it's one of the reasons why intersectional feminism, which is really the most meaningful, useful kind of feminist inquiry, is so essential to the kind of work you're all doing. By the way, but let me warn you now. That sounds as though you all don't already know this. Let me remind you that crafty militarizers will embrace LGBTQ soldiers. Crafty militarizers will encourage new immigrants to speed their way towards citizenship by joining the military. Crafty militarizers know how to militarize unity, belonging, and equality. So while the most crude of militarizers live on division and exclusion and marginalization, patriarchy is always being modernized. It's always being updated. That's why it thrives in Silicon Valley. And the crafty militarizers embrace everybody, but not in the same uses. So beware of imagining that militarizers and patriarchs are just excluders, perhaps just as risky for all of us is that militarizers are embracers.
Short questions, short answers, so many hands.
Hi, Cynthia, it's Aisha. I want to ask about the crafty militarizing that's happening of the UN, especially of humanitarian efforts right now. We discussed this in the roundtable before, the defunding of UNRWA, the UN organization providing humanitarian support in Gaza, and how the militarization of the Nordic countries is really having a militarizing effect of the international system of human rights and of the UN. And I know you've been in great conversations with Israeli feminists and Palestinian feminists over the years. I would love to hear your reflections also regarding what you mentioned earlier on complicity, your recent thinking on complicity.
Thanks, Aisha. This is a continuation of Aisha's and my, 25-year conversation? We're going on 25 years, I think. Yes, absolutely. And there are always new questions that Aisha brings up. And they're always valuable. You can militarize humanitarian aid. It's the people who, Aisha, who really taught me about that and to be on the alert for it and to worry about it, but not always know what to do about it, were Bosnian feminists. Because during the war that tore apart the former Yugoslavia in the name of rival militarisms and nationalisms, during that war, but also in Sudan, also in Ethiopia. I mean, there are many people we can be tutored by. Food convoys, health supply convoys were often allowed to go through checkpoints or through rival militaries' regions only if they accepted military protection from the local, whatever the local rival military was. And I heard humanitarian aid, long time, dedicated, risk-taking, humanitarian aid people worry out loud about should they accept that protection. And what did it mean to have armed military guards on their humanitarian food trucks? So we can learn a lot from humanitarian aid people who have been facing this terrible dilemma for years. Diane Mazarana at Tufts University here in Massachusetts at the Fletcher School is one of the people who's taught me about this. Humanitarian aid, now desperately needed, of course, in Gaza, can be militarized. It can be militarized by the Egyptian military government, which has their own agenda, needless to say. It can be militarized by any of the donors who withhold their support for that humanitarian aid with militarized conditions for their support. Obviously can be militarized by the IDF, the Israeli military. Anybody who puts conditions, militarized, war-waging, war-furthering conditions on access and transport of humanitarian aid has to be challenged outright, because food should not ever be weaponized. And that's what those conditions do. Medical supplies should never be weaponized. That is turned into a militarized lever in the midst of an armed conflict. Talk to humanitarian, and many of you know humanitarian aid workers with long experience. Talk to them about how they sorted out these terrible dilemmas, these excruciating pressures. How did they sort them out? And with what consequences do they now think for the way they sorted them out? Thanks, Aisha.
Two more in here. I have Lena and then I have somebody in the back. I don't know your name, so we'll see.
Quick. Thanks, Cynthia, so much. More than 40 years ago, you asked
or you actually warned us about NATO. I think this was in the late 1970s. You warned us about NATO as a lesson machine that goes around and that we should be wary about these lessons. And if we think now, 40 years after, taking into consideration that Finland has recently joined NATO, Sweden will probably join very soon. What, if we take a look of these 40 years, what are some of these lessons we should write to our notebooks and take note of? Thanks.
Hi, Lena. By the way, in the coffee break, be sure and ask Lena about her work in Liberia. Right, with women veterans of that terrible civil war. Make use of all of Lena's knowledge here. I think NATO presents itself, and we're talking about, they're the individual 31 state members. And when you talked about joint exercises and so on, but then there's also NATO, which is the institutional culture of Brussels, right? And I think from my little experience that one of the things that the people in Brussels who see themselves as representing and furthering NATO as an institution, they think of themselves as more rational than anybody else. And we know from Carol Cohn and others that rationality is always wielded in the name of patriarchal authority. So watch NATO's notions of modernization, rationality, sense. Beware of who is allegedly sensible. And watch what lessons come out of them, because they have worked very deliberately over the last 20 years to incorporate more women, for instance, into NATO forces. Some states have resisted that. Some states have embraced, NATO states have embraced that. Some have resisted it. So if you look at all the NATO forces, and you can get these figures, if you look at all the NATO forces, there's a huge range. Of course, in Iceland, it's 0 for men and women, but there's a huge range of percentages of women in NATO forces. Take those 31, they are not all uniform, but what is true is that NATO institutionally has presented the incorporation of women into the uniform NATO forces as a measure, in NATO's institutional cultural terms, as a measure of rational, modern military force construction.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's just end it there. Yes, good question. Let me just end with this. Sorry, Annik, look out. I know I could go on, but here's the thing to do, is to study NATO in Brussels. Don't make it amorphous. NATO is as real as the Finnish Ministry of Education. NATO is as real as the Swedish corporation of Saab. Right? NATO is an institution that is not just amorphous. It is very particular. It has institutional cultural standards. It has measures of success and measures of frustration. And they need to be watched with a feminist curiosity.
Thank you. Now, one last question, and then we let you go because we have probably exhausted you. But hi, Sylvia, can you hear me?
Yes, I think so. Let's hear.
So thank you for this great keynote. This is a fantastic time also to represent myself. So I come from an organization that represents both EU and NATO. So I'm Susanna Kujapa. I work as an analyst at the European Centre for Countering Hybrid Threats. And first, I would really like to thank you for your research and work. I still remember the first time when I read your banana speeches and bases, so quite a few years back, which opened my eyes to new perspectives in international relations. And that's probably part of the reason why I thought that you really have to know your enemy and really like get into security politics with a bit more feminist perspective, I would say. But it's really a lonely task at times. So second, I would really like to say for the whole audience, that it really feels good to have so many women and other feminists around me interested in security politics, because it really demands quite a bit to keep on going. And one of the panelists said that, are we really doing enough and taking enough space in these discussions in security politics? And I really don't think so. And there's more room for that. But I think that there are also very good reasons for that. And one question that I would have for you and the whole audience that we can maybe continue after this is that how do you maintain your well-being and keep your spirits up when progress of one's work is not visible and you're faced with belittling and constant social sanctioning in this majority conservative, overly masculine environment? And one thing that many have taken up the lessons that we have learned from the situation in Palestine, but also in Myanmar and elsewhere. And I think that one of the greatest lessons that I have learned from both of those beautiful people is that our voices should really comfort those who are disturbed and disturb those who are comfortable. So thank you for your wife, Cynthia. And I'd really like to learn that how do you keep on going after decades of such hard work? Thank you. Wonderful question to end with, Cynthia. So,
Well,
anything else you want to say?
Well, thank you very much. I think this is really important for us all. It's one of the reasons why I wish I were there in person with you all, because I think one of the ways, let's turn it around for a minute. One of the ways we are discouraged, one of the ways we are made to burn out. Burnout isn't something from the inside. Burnout is something that's imposed on you. Is to make you feel you're alone. It was one of the great lessons I've learned from reading Hannah Arendt, is that autocrats, patriarchs, militarizers, misogynists, or the sexual harasser in your own small office, one of the ways they silence you, get you to quit, is to make you imagine you're alone. But you're not alone. You're never alone. You have colleagues. You have friends. You have listeners. You have sharers. You're never alone. We're never alone. Ever.
Now you can see me. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you so much for joining us early in the morning from your time. And we wish you all the best and hope to see you for real again soon.
See you for real, Anna, for real.
Thank you. One thing I wanted to say to you, it's not working again, I'm just going to have to yell. Just to kind of come from what Cynthia said, if you want to keep on having these conversations. If you don't want to feel alone, send me a message and we'll make some kind of a network and carry on these conversations together. Thank you.